Okay, welcome back to HP, the lecture on perception. This is the second part. So we had talked about psychodynamic theories. We had started on the topic of trait theories, and we talked a little bit historically on Alport and how Eysenck sort of added a number of tests and methodologies to get around what he thought were the non-scientific laws of psychodynamic theory. He wanted them to be repeated in trait theory. Modern trait theories um, follow up on the factor analysis method developed by Isaac. And specifically in the US, Cattell um, used the same kind of inventory data to do factor analysis that Isaac had run. And he added some other kinds of objective tests. So he added um, IQ tests, a certain personality history, and using all of that data, he again did factor analysis, trying to find out which bits of data stick together. And he identified what are now become the standard sort of major trait uh, theories, trait dimensions. The five, they're called the big five, and what the ones he identified were, first of all, extroversion, introversion, as Eysenck had identified. So, how outgoing you are, how adventurous, how much you seek the limelight that makes you extroverted, how much you are energized by company. And introverts would be people who are tired by company, relatively shy, not so outgoing, and so on. Second dimension is neuroticism, again, as Eysenck had found. So, how many negative emotions do you have? Do you worry a lot? Are you anxious a lot? How much sort of do you give in to your impulses? All of these would be coming under neuroticism. Then there is agreeableness. So, Isaac's third dimension is divided up into further three over here. The first two dimensions overlap. So agreeableness in Big Five is how good-natured, cooperative, secure you are, how generally open and friendly you are. So how friendly you are. Conscientiousness, which is the fourth dimension, is how sort of persistent and persevering you are, how tidy you are, how dependable you are, following through with what you said, how responsible you are. These all come under the conscientiousness dimension, which of course is very important from in terms of hiring. Openness to experience is the final dimension, which is how curious, imaginative, questioning you are. Do you seek out new experiences, and so on and so forth. Um, in terms of reliability, uh, um, these big five have been cross-culturally tested, and you find again and again that they are um, you find the same dimensions appearing in multiple cultures. Also, people are significantly stable on these big five measurements. So someone who has scored a certain point in the big five at age 20 is likely to be very close to that for a very long period of time. So that makes us confident that we are truly measuring personality. Whatever we are measuring is stable over a long period of time. So these are particularly stable after the age 30. Um, People who are young sort of tend to there tends to be a dip in the score of neuroticism um, around the teenage years. So people become um, more prone to anxiety, more prone to negative emotions, more prone to reacting emotionally to others. So there's that sort of instability, as it were, but they become um, less neurotic sort of after the teenage years. Also, they tend to become uh, more conscientious. Also, that's something that tends to grow. Um, Also, after 30, people tend to become less extroverted and less open to appear, to open to new experiences. So there are slight time-dependent changes, um, but by and large, the measurements tend to be highly stable. And why? Uh, well, most likely there is a maturational pattern to this. So as we are maturing post the teenage years, negativity of emotionality goes down, agreeableness, conscientiousness goes up. This could also it could be maturation. So it's known that there are a number of frontal lobe and prefrontal lobe areas that continue to develop into the early 20s. And the idea here is those are producing the slightly rising square. That would be a maturational explanation. There's also an idea that this steady change that you see is based on a common experience. It's a learning signal, not a maturational signal. As people steady down into jobs and become more secure in the knowledge of who they are, so the negativity tends to decline, insecurities and so on tend to decline. Also, as you keep on meeting the same people, when you set into a job, a career, you tend to decrease the number of new and exciting people that you're meeting because a big part of your life basically means meeting the same people over and over again. And that may lead to a lowering of or openness to new experience or uh, and so on. So these slight time-based changes may be due to common experience or a maturational pattern. But overall, empirically speaking, in terms of data, these are highly reliable. The big five dimensions are highly reliable. This is in contrast to some other trait type of tests that are not so reliable and valid. So there is a Myers-Briggs test which is available online, which classifies people as having certain traits, including introversion, extroversion, sensing, feeling, and उस तरह की उसकी 14 या 16 वो dimensions बताता है. But that one, the actual data suggests that it's whatever it's measuring, it's not measuring personality because people's the scores that they get on that test tend to change fairly rapidly. So whatever it's measuring, it's not particularly stable. Also, it's not very well correlated with other psychological variables and other measures of behavior, again suggesting that it's not necessarily testing something particularly deep. But it's very entertaining, the Myers-Briggs test. You can look it up on Google and you can even take it. Um, but and it because it's free, it's quite widely used. But that again, it's not actually a reliable instrument for measuring personality. Um, Now, the big five obviously don't encompass all of uh, personality or stable aspects of characteristic, and they have been sort of um, they've been criticized for it. So, for example, one obvious thing that they leave out is psychopathy. The trait of psychopathy, well established, relatively reliable, but it's not considered a part of Big Five. Psychopathy, we'll look at it later. It's basically high on psychopathy. People tend to be not 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 very empathetic and not responsive to learning signals, to punishment signals in particular ways. Similarly, humorousness, again, stable dimension, but not included. Religiousness is not included. These are all stable dimensions, but they are not uh, included in the part of the Big Five. So, Big Five as a personality construct leaves out significant chunks of behavior. So, where do these Big Five come from? What is the cause for them? Remember, Allport had suggested that they're primarily learnt by patterns of reinforcements and punishments, which later become what he called functionally autonomous. But the current works shows, in fact, a significant heritability of traits. They are they seem to be strongly inherited. There are a variety of methods that show this heritability. So, for example, um, if they are genetically based, then we should expect to find them in common, close related species. We can also, if we are trying to look at their heritable, look at newborn infants. Idea being for those environment has not had a role to play yet. They haven't been living for a very long time. So maybe if we still find clearly identified traits there, we would again look at that as evidence that these are inherited. And finally, for heritability, we would look at twin studies, which is the classic way of identifying whether something is heritable or not. So, starting with animals, anybody who's interacted with animals will tell you that animals of a single species nonetheless vary a lot and they vary very distinctly in terms of their behavior. As far distant a species as an octopus, when you can very easily divide up their behavior. The octopuses, which if you put meal into the sort of place that they're in, some of them will immediately run up and gobble the meal. Other one of them will stay away from it and they won't approach it until the observer experimenter goes out, and then they'll rush and eat. Right? So this, in a sense, carefulness or reactiveness to potential threats varies a lot from individual to individual. So um, this suggests at least, I mean, not just in mammals, but as octopus, of course, is invertebrate. So it's very distantly related. So you have these characteristic behavioral patterns which correspond to something like the dimensions, big five dimensions that we are looking at, even in those. Again, in other animals, if you study dogs, in a well-known study, what they did was they had owners identify whether their dogs had particular traits in common, which of the big five traits their dogs had. Right? Then they had friends of the dog's owners independently fill out the same thing. And finally, you had strangers who did not know the owners, had not met the dogs, but had seen them, video films of them, again, rate them on the big five. All three of these ratings agreed with one another. So people, objectively speaking, because the strangers and friends and owners are all rating them the same way, dogs' behaviors show things like whether they're open to experience, whether they're sort of have a lot of negative emotions and so on and so forth. And they can be reliably observed in their behaviors, again, suggesting these are not just figments of owner's imagination. कि मेरा ये वाला कुत्ता बड़ा friendly है, ये वाला बड़ा shy है. That's a clear distinction that owners very often make. And it suggests that, in fact, that is the case. Even objective observers can verify via behavioral characteristics of these animals. So you have traits. These big five are not limited to human beings, as we would expect. If they were genetic, you find them in related species as well. And you have these characteristic behavioral differences. Then we can also look at babies and do they, very close after birth, have clear behavioral temperamental differences. And again, there's very, very widespread reports and objective measurements of behavior that babies right from birth are distinct, have distinct tendencies. So some babies are very placid and calm, and other ones are easily disturbed. They're very irritable. They start crying at the slightest noise or disturbance. Then there are babies that are soothable. So if they get upset, you pick them up and they immediately snuggle in and get comfort and get comfortable and settle down. Whereas babies that are fidgety, that they don't like being cuddled and struggle against it. These um, are stable in time. These patterns are stable in time. So babies that are irritable or fidgety or placid and calm soon after birth, they are reporting, the irritable, fidgety ones are reporting to be still anxious at age 5, getting a lot of bad dreams, have fears about monsters under the bed, even when they have not had any life experiences, negative life experiences in that intervening phase. And then the idea here is that these extend also, these continue and become the roots of sort of the kind of things that we would call openness to experience or neuroticism or um, sort of um, sort of warmth of personality. At the heart of it are these temperamental differences that are present right at birth and continue all the way along. So you can't directly map dimensions onto early temperament, but because these temperaments feed in different ways into develop or mature into and have different impacts on multiple sets of traits. So the idea again is that starting so early, it's very likely something inbuilt rather or the inbuilt component, biological component, inherited component has a big role to play in this. The final sort of thing that we can talk about is, of course, twin studies. And you have the classic sort of idea that identical twins share, have greater concordance of big five traits, and dizygotic twins have less so. Particularly important are twins that have been raised in different in adopted homes, identical twins raised in adopted homes. If environment is producing traits to a great extent, you should see that they resemble their families, their adopted families, more than each other in terms of the big five traits. But in fact, study after study shows that monozygote twins are more similar to each other in the big five traits, even when they've been adopted in different families. So all of these are suggesting that there are significant heritable components, and studies have started linking groups of genes to various types of traits. Because traits are broad dimensions, as we would expect, they are not dependent on one or two genes, but are smeared over the products of a large number of genes. So इतना simple नहीं है कि ये gene हो तो extrovert हो जाते हैं, वो gene हो तो introvert हो जाते हैं. It's not as simple as that. Multiple genes are producing effect, but nonetheless, they are finding that show that. So what are those genes doing? What is the proximal cause? Distal cause, far away cause is the genes. Genes ने कुछ किया body में, phenotype में, तो फिर ये behavior आया. So what kind of phenotypic phenomenon are we seeing? Again, we see a number of um, structural impacts of genes, which in turn are related to personality dimensions. So, for neuroticism, it's known that a highly reactive nervous system, a nervous system that gives a full blown anxiety or autonomic nervous system response to loud or some threatening stimuli, some loud noise. And do you have a partial autonomic response or a full blown response? Those with narcissism tend to have a lower threshold at which a response is produced, and they produce a higher response. So they are generally of higher reactivity. Um, those are the proximal causes in the phenotype or the personality difference that we produce, and the distal or faraway causes would be genes. Genes cause structure, which is the proximal cause, and that in turn causes the personality variables that we see. Um, and estimates of heritability is around range from about zero point 0.5 to zero point 0.7 or so. Um, so big chunk of big five are heritable, but there is of course that other zero point 0.5 left. So there is some environmental influences happening, and to an extent. Um, so how do environmental situations produce an impact on personality? Well, to an extent, by definition in personality, we mean something that is stable across situations. But nonetheless, you will find that the situations do deflect personality in particular sorts of ways. So someone is an extrovert is not necessarily chatting and laughing away at a funeral. Even an introvert is being chatty at a wedding. So those situations are producing an effect, and there are standard ways in which it produces ideas, standard ways they produce an effect um, through reinforcements and punishments. Um, but um, there are also more roundabout ways in which they are producing an impact. So a lot of theorists social cognitive learning theorists of personality say that yes, you have this heritable tendencies in the form of traits, but they are sort of molded and altered. Sometimes maybe enhanced, sometimes maybe eroded a little by reinforcements and punishments, but also sort of people's individuals' learning histories, their beliefs that they come to have about themselves, their expectations based on their experiences. All of them are sort of mediating these inbuilt sort of um, biologically driven behavioral tendencies. So a child who works hard in early school in a classroom is praised for it, and they take it to heart that yeah, you say hard work, something positive happens, they get reinforcement, and they sort of work harder and are more happy in the classroom, and they are labeled as being ambitious, industrious, and so on. Whereas a child who works hard does not do so well would sort of uh, would if they're not sort of encouraged or helped or praised in class, they'll sort of come to have the belief that this is all not worthwhile, nothing good comes of it, and they'll be labeled as being unmotivated or sort of withdrawn. And so the idea here is that your inner tendencies make you behave in certain ways that has outcomes in particular situations, and you remember those outcomes and learn to expect them. And that may encourage you in certain traits and discourage you in, for example, exhibiting traits in certain situations also. So, you may have somebody who's a very extrovert person outside the classroom, but not inside classroom because, they've had negative experiences there. So this idea is called reciprocal determinism, that your traits impact the kind of activities that you choose and do. And then there's outcomes, then sometimes enhance or inhibit those traits. And there's a feedback loop for this. This is the sort of reciprocal determinism. Sometimes it will enhance those traits, and sometimes it will tend to dampen some traits down in certain situations. So basically, you have built in temperaments, you have habits, along with perceptions and beliefs, and that via certain rewards, punishments, and outcomes will focus you in one direction or another direction in terms of your behavior. Um, in particular, in terms of environments, people and Freudian theory, for example, had thought that probably the most important situational or environmental impact that you have is the family, right? Your early environment. Um, but what we find, in fact, is that if we look at, 0.5% तो heritable है, वो बाकी 0.5% जो है, वो environment, family and shared environment, जिसको हम कहते हैं families predict करती है. Again, we already know it doesn't because adopted people have don't share a lot of personalities with traits with their siblings in the inherited household. So that claim that parenting has the biggest influence turns out certainly not to be the case when we measure personality via the big five. In fact, a lot more impact seems to be happening due to what is called unique events or non-shared environments. So whether you were the one out of your siblings who broke your arm when you were 5, or you were the one who had Miss So and so, who's a brilliant math teacher in class 3, these sorts of, or whether you got an unusual set of friends, these are the ones that actually turn out to be of very lasting impact in terms of personality, rather than the shared environment which is your parent. Um, and there's a number of reasons for that. Um, Very few parents actually, I mean, if this environment had an impact, you would think that siblings would have very similar personalities, but they don't, as measured by the big five. One of the reasons for this is that very few parents actually have a consistent child rearing style. Anybody, you know, with multiple siblings already knows this. मैं सबसे बड़ा था, मुझे तो किसी चीज की इजाजत नहीं मिली जब तक तीसरे बच्चे की बारी आई। वो मतलब उसका नाम भी याद नहीं है, वो जो मर्जी गलियों में रुल रहा है, खेल रहा है, याशियां कर रहा है, मेरे पे सारे वो हो गए, राइट? सो दैट suggests of course a lack of a child rearing child rearing style. Um, even when the parents very often alter their strategies with the temperament of the child. So parents will answer this kind of complaint कि जी मुझे तो उसे तो खुली आजाद दी है, मुझे नहीं दी हुई. Parents will very often answer it with the saying कि क्योंकि वो शरीफ आदमी है, तुम बदमाश हो, तुम पे नजर रखनी पड़ती है, right? So parents very often change their style and alter it with temperaments. So children and parents' temperaments interact to produce a rearing style, and this varies with combinations of temperaments. So एक बच्चे के साथ एक तरह, एक बच्चे के साथ दूसरी तरह. Um, there is also, even when parents are consistent, there can be very different outcomes. तो उन्होंने तो स्टाइल तो एक ही रखा, लेकिन एक टेम्परामेंट के साथ इंटरैक्ट करके उस स्टाइल का एक इफेक्ट हुआ. One child becomes very high achieving, very focused, and very studious. Another child becomes sort of a black sheep, aggressive, rebellious, and so on and so forth. So the same style can produce different outcomes. So these are all reasons why parental shared environment, parental style doesn't predict big five personality traits very well. Of course, parents are highly influential in that they very often do influence the sort of values that people have, the lifestyle that children have, what they aspire to. Within those sort of cognitive um, sort of setups, children continue to have different personalities and express them in different ways. So, they'll have the same values, but they'll have a different personality playing at those values, which is a different thing. So if not parents, you have the influence of non-shared environments, and that includes the sets of friends that you have, peers. Peers certainly have a very, very powerful impact. So anybody who's been sort of punished by a peer group. So in your kids, when your kids, friends making fun of you of the way you speak or the way that you dress, really has a biting, sharp impact on a person. So peer groups can affect real punishment and reinforcement signals. And not surprisingly, they cause significant alterations, changing of behaviors in terms of who they are. Um, which is why, as you would expect, people very often show one set of behaviors when with their friends, another set of behaviors with their parents, because there's that powerful situational influence, particularly from peers, that is happening. If you ask about if there's a clash of values, who tends to win, more often than not, between parents and peers, the peers win, which is why culture tends to change over time, because on the whole, people tend to follow their own group rather than being directly influenced by their parents. So a big part of personality, even as measured in Big Five, is coming from environmental signals. But on those signals, the accidents of life, who your group was, who your uh, unusual life experience that you had, are producing more of an impact than the style, raising style of your parents. That produces more of an impact. Which is not to say that parents have no impact at all. Um, they do sort of shift around people on where they are on dimensions. Someone with sort of high degree of irresponsibility and so on, um, classic, so, impulsivity, irresponsibility, low conscientiousness, and so on. This is a classic recipe for, let's say, a criminal lifestyle. But not all of the people end up with that. You find a lot of these people who had those traits, nonetheless, still have those traits, but have settled down to some extent. And very often that's attributable to consistent parenting, consistent sort of responsibilities, consistent signaling, consistent training, and of course, warmth and emotional contact being constantly provided. So parents can shift people around on exactly where they are on the dimension, but they don't create personality where you happen to be on those dimensions. Um, yeah, so um, in this sense, we can also uh, think about therapy as doing something like the same thing. If you are an introvert, psychological therapy is not going to turn you into an extrovert. It will move you around within your introversion, give you a couple of skill sets and things like that, so that you are able to cope a little bit better in where you are standing. But it's unreasonable to expect personality changes as an outcome for therapy. Uh, because at the end of the day, that is an environmental influence and it has certain kinds of effect, but up to a point. The biological impulse is strong in terms of personality. Um, so, moving beyond situations like non-shared environments like your friends and accidental events in your life and shared environments, we can also look at the bigger picture and look at what are the cultural influences on personality. Right? Parents sort of can sort of do reciprocal determinism by putting you in certain schools, putting you with certain like-minded groups of family, उन लोगों के साथ बच्चों से दोस्ती होनी चाहिए वो हमारे जैसे लोग हैं. They can sort of do reciprocal determinism and influence your personality that way. But of course, there's a bigger reciprocal determinism, which is coming via the overall shared culture that all of us in a particular uh, part of the world live in. And people can certainly talk about this. So when we talk about Italians being very excitable and expressive, we are suggesting that all of them have this personality trait, but very likely we are talking about a culture. Similarly, we can think about quickness to anger as a personality trait in some cultures. But again, we can we can see whether we can talk. Those are clearly, although we are identifying them as personality traits, they're probably cultural phenomenon that we are dealing with. When we try and understand culture's impact on personality, one very major distinction that emerges is between individualistic cultures and collective cultures. Individualist cultures are what we associate with the West, particularly the United States. Collective cultures are more of Asian phenomenon, particularly Far Eastern Korea, Japan, China would be classic collectivist cultures. And these impact personality very dramatically, starting from how people think about personality in the first place. The idea of personality being a set of characteristics that you possess as an individual is something that you find much more strongly and in individualistic cultures. Whereas in collective cultures, if you ask people who are you or what are you like, they very often start by talking about their relationships in their community. So I'm from so and so family. Our family has been doing this business for 3 generations, or I'm so and so's related to so and so. These people are by that defining themselves in a collective way. Uh, that's how they think about personality. So certainly Chinese people, if you asked to answer the question, "Who am I?" Chinese people tend to answer in terms of relationships that they have. I'm so and so son, so and so's daughter. I'm so and this person's uncle. I'm a member of this community. Whereas English speakers, American speakers tend to talk about attributes. I'm an ambitious person who's really interested in doing this, not so interested in that, right? So those are individual attributes they talk about. Cultures also sort of profoundly influence the goals that we find valuable, the thoughts that we think positive. So, इससे नहीं बुरा सोचा so, अल्लाह पे भरोसा रखना चाहिए. These are the kinds of attributions, that thoughts that we place high value on, low value on, how we weigh costs and benefits. These are all producing an impact on the cognitive part of the socio-cognitive, socio and cognitive part of social cognitive. Uh, level of personality. Um, and because collectivist cultures value these things so much, um, they tend to view an individual as being much more transformative and adaptive to the various social relationships you find yourself. Okay, so if you ask a Japanese person, uh, if you think of the various social roles you perform as someone's child, as someone's parent, as somebody's boss, as somebody's employee, how much are you the same person in all of these situations? A lot of Japanese persons, people would say, I'm less than 10% the same person. 90% changes from situation to situation. In fact, they have a word, tachiba, which is playing your social roles to such perfection that your personality almost disappears, becomes blended in completely with what is required of you by your social relationships. In contrast, most Americans, if you ask them, are you the same person with your parents, with your partner, with your employer? And they would say about 90% I'm the same person. 5 to 10% changes my situation. Otherwise, I'm more or less the same thing. So significant uh, differences in how people characterize themselves, their personality, depending on which culture they belong to. And of course, cultures themselves, by valuing some things and not valuing some things, enhance some attributes, some traits, and not some others. So things like we already talked about things like emotional expressibility, right? We would think it as a personality trait, but it's culturally influenced, which is why you have it in Mediterranean cultures. Similarly, something like altruism, the desire to do good to others, even at cost to yourself. Right? We would think of that as a personal dimension. This person is a good person personally. They have this trait of altruism. But in fact, you find it varies a lot by culture rather than by personal choices. Specifically, what you find is that cultures in which children from young childhood are assigned household tasks, so who help care for their younger siblings, who do food preparation, who help feed their siblings, they tend to be far more altruistic as a whole than cultures in which this does not happen. Um, so it's a cultural variable as much as a personal choice. I mean, the classic example I always give of this is, अगर कोई सड़क पे लाहौर की सड़क पे आप देखें कभी कोई गिर गया, ठीक है, सही एक्सीडेंट हो गया, कोई गिरा पड़ा, साइकिल वाले मोटरसाइकिल वाले पैदल बंदे उसके पास रुकेंगे, गाड़ी वाला नहीं रुकेंगे, ये बहुत कम है, uh, because people of different socioeconomic status are coming from a household where they've taken child rearing, food preparation as a part of their daily lifestyle, and therefore they have a tendency, behavioral tendency to help out where they see it needed. Whereas we in cars, middle class household, don't shift very much in the house. So we think of ourselves as being isolated, as being there being a hard boundary around the person. It's somebody's job, somebody's injured, किसी की profession है, look after them, मेरा नहीं काम, right? So that's a sort of a distinction that is there. Then also in terms of how we value time and move with time. So again, these you can divide cultural societies culturally into a linear time societies in which time is divided up into series of segments, and some your job owner pays you a certain part of the time. So and then the rest of the time belongs to this person, your family, and so on. So we linearly organize it to if you have a missing segment, इसमें कोई काम slotted नहीं है, that's wasted time. If we slot up, if we agree to meet someone and are late for it, we are wasting their time. Right? Whereas in other societies, time is considered sort of parallel. So, you have relationships and you to maintain. And हाँ मैं चाचा के घर रुक गया था इससे तो कोई बात नहीं मेरे भी चाचा हैं तो मुझे पता है कैसे होता है. So people will not be so time conscious and will juggle and use their time in parallel ways. These again are cultures. In linear cultures, it can be very insulting. To, I remember my Japanese, I had a Japanese, one of my tutors is Japanese, and he explained to me that he says, I know I've met people from South Asia, so I understand you're 5 minutes late. It's okay. He said, but in Japan, if a graduate student was 5 minutes late to see someone like me, uh, I would understand it as this person has calculated me, insulted me, that your time is so of so little value to me that I'm wasting 5 minutes. So he said, after that, I was very, very particular. And in general, um, um, अब तो खैर थोड़े रिलैक्स हो गए लेकिन नम्स में ट्रेडिशन ये होती थी कि we would turn up 5 minutes before class time and at class time we would lock the door. If you were late, too bad. Now, obviously, I didn't say that was a good thing. I'm just saying at that time it was much more strongly a business school, and they worked harder to inculcate the linear time idea because in many ways is very foreign to our culture, whereas international business culture certainly works very much by linear time ideas. So, so that was another cultural way in which behaviors and tendencies can alter very broad aspects of our behavior. One further sort of, pattern in which culture influences what we think is a personality trait, right, is aggression and violence. So Nisbet looks at patterns of violence, and he suggests that there's a cultural sociological elements to it, which he traces back. He's talking about the US, so he finds that there's a pattern in the US which is almost state by state, even county by county, uh, where in one part of the US you have a lot of crimes against people. So it seems like random crimes that people will fight each other and beat each other up or shoot each other. But at the heart of it is always sort of a um, personal disrespect. Somebody disrespected me and you got into a fight. Whereas in other parts of the US, you don't find that pattern of aggression and violence anymore. And he traces it back to original patterns of migration to the US. And he suggests one part of the US was primarily, the immigrants were primarily from the north of England who were herders, not agriculturists. They herd animals, versus in the rest of the US they were primarily settled agriculturists. And he argues that herders, particularly, are economically very vulnerable because their entire wealth is living creatures on legs. So they are not highly vigilant. They can lose everything in an afternoon. Whereas agriculturalists, because they have the titles of ownership of land, they can go up and down, but their assets are still. So this, he suggests, leads to a culture of being hyper alert and hypersensitive to threats and perceived threats in herders. And therefore, there's a much higher, what he calls a culture of honor, of being hyper vigilant of, of, of insults and of potential threats to your honor, which could, if you don't answer them, would lead to a dramatic loss of your bill. And he suggests these have persisted generation by generation in the US, and he tested it out in a very interesting experiment. So he had people take a saliva sample. When you get aggressive or tense, one of the things that happens is you get cortisol, which is a neurotransmitter and hormone release, and it shows up in your saliva. So the experiment he did was that he had people from northern US and people from the southern US sort of come in for it. He didn't tell them the purpose. He come in for a test, and while they're heading into the lab, this person who's sent by the experimenter accidentally bumps into them and sort of mutters asshole and walks on. So it's an insulting thing. And he finds that people from the south, one, were much more aggressive and angry at this, and in fact their cortisol levels were elevated, meaning really they had an autonomic nervous system response to this, whereas those from the north were sort of shrugging it off. Some of them even found it funny, they laughed it off. and their cortisol levels are much lower. So really, he's saying this cultural difference, the culture of honor difference, actually imprints itself or influences the way our physiology is behaving in terms of our autonomic nervous system responses. So it really, the culture really internalizes a lot of these things as traits. Now, obviously, you want to avoid sort of stereotyping cultures, as you know, every Italian is sort of excitable, every sort of Scotsman is easily enraged. Um, so these are tendencies, not clear cut signals. And certainly, cultures have a lot of variations within them. We can see there's more variations than appear from the outside. So if you think of what an ordinary Pakistani would think of, what is their conception of Lum student and Lum's culture, you being inside Lums know that in fact there's a big variation within them. Even within collectivist cultures, Chinese and Japanese are both collectivist cultures, but Chinese value individual achievement within a culture. So they will say this person is one of our family, so proud of him for doing so well. That's a kind of collective thing that they have. Whereas the Japanese, also collective, will promote group consensus and say it was all everybody. It's important for all of us to work together to achieve whatever we are going to achieve. So within that, there are significant kinds of variations. Also, finally, of course, so as not to stereotype personality and culture in all cultures have broad overlapping similarities. They're all human cultures and they all sort of have significant shared elements to them. And these differences that we are talking about are on average differences which will produce a slight impact on in some types of personal people's behavior. It's not as if cultures are unidimensional and distinct. They're multidimensional. A lot of those dimensions are shared. Okay, now this naturally leads us um, to the internal and experience. How do you experience personality from the inside? Notice traits are sort of very objective biological looks at people. That people have these tendencies and patterns. Um, but how does it feel like to go through life, and are people different in their perceived experiences of what life is like? For so this is not really addressed by psychodynamic theories or trait theories to very great extent. To understand these approaches, you have to move to a set of personality theories which are called the humanist approach. And there's a variety of humanist approaches as well. Um, for example, Maslow, who's famous for his hierarchy of motives, um, suggests that psychology is too interested in negativity and ignores the peak positive experiences of what it is to be a person. And for him, people are not different according to the big five personality dimensions. Those are not important. What's really important is what do you feel most alive doing? What do you enjoy most? How do you seek it out? How do you feel when you are blocked or can't seek out what makes you feel like it's the ideal thing for you to be doing? So for Maslow, people are self-actualizers. They are trying to move towards experiences that make them the most creative, the most broad person that they can be. And people's personalities are the degree to which they've accomplished it, the strategies by which they are searching, whether they've been disappointed or blocked or helped or hindered in this. These would be how you would segregate people ki ye is tarah ka, ye is tarah ka, is tarah ka. And that's what's more important about people rather than the big five personalities. So this is very clearly sort of an inside view of what it means to be a person. So someone who is um, an artist who really enjoys working the work of art has a reasonable amount of success compared to someone who, for example, is very interested in cooking and they really want to enjoy the finest cuts of meat and cook them really well, but they hardly have the time because their job doesn't allow them to do that very well and just do it once or twice every 2 or 3 weekends. For Maslow, this uh, would be the real difference between personalities. That this person is hindered in their self-actualization and has perhaps not searched as much as they want for what really makes them feel alive and breadth and creative, whereas this one has, for him, that's really the important part of what personality differences are and what personality is all about. So that's Maslow's idea to do with peak experiences and self-actualization. Rogers, in contrast, has a slightly different view. So he thinks that, I mean, it's similar. It has correspondences with Maslow's ideas. Rogers' idea is that um, people have a natural tendency, which he calls the organism, and then they have a knowledge or view or expectation of themselves, which he calls the self. And for Rogers, uh, for a fully developed or functional personality, these two have to be identical or overlapping, right? So what does he mean by that? Let's say if I ask you कि जी आप क्या करते हैं? तो आप कहें कि जी मैं गिटार बजाता हूँ और वीकेंड पे we friends jam and we really enjoy ourselves and okay, so that's what you spend your time doing. And what are you planning to be? What are you planning to be studying? Well, actually, I'm planning to be an accountant. I'm doing ACF. Okay, so okay, what do you do for accounting? Well, I try and study, but it's really boring. But every now and then, I try and do it library and try and do it. Now, this is classic what Rogers would call a lack of congruence between self and organism. That your body's doing one thing, but your claim about who you are is very different. Yourself, which you recognize and say this is who I am, is very different from what your body actually does. So this can happen in a variety of ways. So let's say thinking about your parents, right? So your parents have spent the last 20 years or so basically 8 hours a day have been parenting, and now all of a sudden you're growing up and you're going to move out of your house. They're going to go away. Once you go to college, you basically go away. You don't ever come back, right? So now they've got 8 hours left of the day, which is so. If you ask them what are you, I'm a parent. Well, actually the job's over, right? So a lot of parents are feeling this gap between what they call themselves and the time, the hours of the day that used to be taken up are not being taken up anymore. I mean, they'll try calling you and keep tabs on you sometime, but you'll be resentful. It won't work out. It doesn't work out, right? So now they're having to reorganize. So maybe they want to go back to a job that they had earlier. Maybe they want to spend more time doing charitable work. Maybe they want to socialize with their friends as well, which they've left off because their friends are also busy. So something is going to change so that these two realign with themselves. And for Rogers, the fully functional person, their self and organism must be in congruence. That's the term used. They must be aligned with one another. And that's what makes a person open and energetic and motivated rather than defensive and sort of avoidant and so on. And for Rogers, unlike psychodynamic theory, psychologists will actually tell you what the solution is. For Rogers, people are capable of realigning themselves by changing their habits, changing their ideas of themselves, bringing both of them together one way or the other. They're capable of doing this. They just need unconditional positive regard. They need to experience the idea that no matter how they make their choices, they'll be people will think positively of them. They'll get positive regard from those outside. So um, मैं अब जाके इस उम्र में फिर से जॉब शुरू करूं और इस उम्र में अपने फ्रेंड के साथ हैंग आउट शुरू करूं क्या सोचेंगे लोग right. So that's what that conditional regard that you're expecting from others, which sometimes you receive from others, holds you back from changing in ways that would bring yourself and organism to alignment. And for Rogers, the therapist's job is really to question people and to make it clear by developing a rapport with them that they will have unconditional positive regard from their therapist, no matter what lifestyle choices they do make. And usually, Roger says this usually is sufficient if done well enough for the person to, by themselves, achieve a congruence between the self and organism. People are have the resources within them to solve their own problem. They don't need a super therapist to change their personalities and eradicate one thing and enhance another. They can do that, all of that themselves. All they need is unconditional positive regard and some time to do self reflection to identify where these lack of congruences are and why they are defensive about it and what is realistic and what is unrealistic in terms of lifestyle choices. So that's Roger's idea. Finally, you have Rollo May, who is sort of influenced by existential philosophy, which says that, look, you know, um, human life is marked by losses. We ultimately we will all die. So in one sense, we lose everything at the end. But in the meantime, also we are marked by losses. Friends move apart. You have fight with friends. Parents sort of grow distant to you. You have relationships that break up. So how do you find meaning in life? How do you make certain things meaningful for you? And under what do you make find something meaningful? Can you make it meaningful? How do you get yourself out of a sense of loss and back into a meaningfulness of living life with a purpose? The ways and patterns in which people succeed or fail in doing so, in finding meaning in dealing with loss, for Rolome, this is personality. Um, this is the existential sort of crisis that all people feel, and how they solve it is their personality. And when you reach the end of a stage of your life, so let's say you're graduating from now, so your entire meaning has been going to classes, hanging out with this group, that group. This was the meaning to your life, and now it's come to an end. And that's what causes transitions in personality, to find new meanings and find new things to shift into, to transition into. That for Rollo would be the core part of personality. So that brings us to the end of um, the topic of personality. As you may have noticed, very, very varied approach, because, of course, personality is a very varied topic. Um, and at least some psychologists have come to the opinion that it's not a very important topic because, in fact, situational and cultural influences are so strong that it doesn't leave a lot of room for personality. But no, that's not what most of us believe, and certainly we find this whole topic quite interesting. So these are the multiple ways in which we can think about it, and that is all for personality. All right, and see you at the review session. Thanks a lot.